Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton, and today we'll be talking all about Harris's selection of a running mate selecting Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. We have a fantastic guest. Do you want to give a brief introduction?
My name is Sohali Vaddula. I'm the National Director of Communications for the College Democrats of America, and I'm from Austin, Texas, and rising sophomore at Brown University.
Fantastic. We're so excited to have you today. You were the perfect guest to discuss all things Tim Walz and this presidential race. I know you were a supporter of him. So we're really excited to have you join us on Pod Save the Youth. So just a little bit of background about what happened over the past few days. On Tuesday morning, Vice President Harris announced that she would be picking Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate. Walz has been named for himself as a progressive governor of a Midwestern state, not necessarily a swing state, but still a governor in a swing region with experience as well in the House of Representatives, where he won as a Democrat in a conservative rural district a number of times. Walz also previously served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years, where he used his military benefits to pay for college before becoming a high school social studies teacher and a football coach. In 2018 and 2022, Walz won his elections, both of his elections for Minnesota's governor office by large margins that indicate that Walz may provide Harris an electoral benefit in other Midwestern and critical swing states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So, what are your initial reactions to hearing Walz's selection?
Yeah, no, I was thrilled. I think many college Democrats and just young people are because it was kind of unexpected. I think we didn't really expect Tim Walz to be picked because there were so many other great contenders, and I know Shapiro was like one of the foremost people that people were talking about. But yeah, that was my initial reaction. I was really excited, and I think this is a really great thing for the Progressive Coalition. So, because like for the first time, they're being heard, and I think that's never really happened on a major Democratic Party's presidential ticket before. So, it's really great that Tim Walz was picked.
Yeah, 100% agree. There was so much energy from especially young people, which we'll talk about more in a second, going into the selection process for Governor Walz and also, I mean, anti Governor Shapiro. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for Democrats at this point to appeal to our generation, to motivate us to get out to vote, and power Harris's campaign forward this November with Governor Walz on the ticket. So I'll also ask, do we think that Tim Walz's bio and electoral experience in the Midwest sets up the Harris campaign to improve her electoral odds in other critical Midwestern states?
I think his history, both serving in Congress and Minnesota as governor, along with his bio as being a former public school teacher, football coach, I think that really does play into it because the electorate, if there's anything, they crave authenticity. And Tim Walz just seems like such a real person that could exist, like someone that you could know, someone that could be your neighbor. And that's just not something we see with like most, establishment politicians. Like they're just not as relatable. Like they've been like had really elite careers or like elite educations, so this is kind of like a breath of fresh air, I think, for a lot of people, which will help them get energized. And I think it will make sure the Democratic Party gets back in touch with working class Americans, like, the most of America, which really can relate to Tim Walz's journey and experience.
100%. And I think you see in both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris's selection for VP that the Midwest is going to be the most critical area to appeal to in this election. And you see someone who Donald Trump thought could help him in JD Vance. And now you see the starkest contrast between the two options in this election. At the top of the ticket, we have a convicted felon versus a prosecutor. And now we have a Midwestern guy who wrote Hillbilly Elegy and, started a hedge fund and went to Yale Law School and abandoned his people in his area and calls them lazy. And now you have a contrast on our side with a Democratic governor who did not go to an Ivy League school, like you said, who has experience serving his country and his community in just the most incredible way. And I think that that contrast is going to be so clear over the next few months. So Walz also has a very progressive record in his governor's office. He has had over the past 2 years only a one vote majority in both houses of the Minnesota legislature, the Minnesota State House and Senate. But despite that, he was able to push through some of those progressive legislation out of any state in the country. I know in here in Massachusetts, our legislature usually passes, 2 to 3 bills every cycle, and we're a full-time legislature. And in Minnesota, they have put us to shame. They have passed incredible things over the past 2 years. They have worked on a bipartisan basis to pass billions of dollars in new funding for schools and infrastructure. Democrats alone passed universal free school meals for Minnesota students, legal protections for abortion rights, restoring providing the largest expansion of voting rights in Minnesota's recent history, legalizing marijuana, creating a statewide family leave program, setting new climate goals to power Minnesota by 100% clean energy by 2040, passed stricter gun laws, and gave undocumented people access to state driver's licenses. It's such a progressive and successful record, indicative of the legislative success that a Walz Harris administration might be able to usher in.
I think it definitely does. It signals a shift in the Democratic Party's like priorities. I also think that it brings a lot of expertise, like Tim Walz being able to run in a district that was red for like decades, being able to flip that district, win, and as governor in basically what is a purple state, right? Having only like one member or having a majority in the Minnesota state legislature by like one person, like by that such a small margin, he's still able to have and be able to implement such progressive reforms within the state. Like I think it is indicative of like a bipartisanship nature that the administration wants to bring back. And that can be really powerful as to like what we can really accomplish as a country, especially if we have Congress in Democratic hands.
Absolutely. Yeah, I am very hopeful. Tim Walz also, in his time as a congressperson, he has developed relationships on Capitol Hill that will definitely help him if he is elected as our next VP. Uh, it will help him push through legislation that will improve people's lives across our country. And obviously, he brings that progressive background, that successful legislative background, but that progressive ideology, which is so important if we're going to have a successful administration over the next 4 years that young people and people across the board can rely on to really improve their lives and our country. So do we think, even though we're motivated by Walz's progressive record and his stances on issues, do we think that this progressive ideology will alienate some voters and ultimately lose him support in some of the country and with some moderate voters? Or do we believe that the energy that we have that as progressives, motivated by Walz's selection, do we think that that is enough to offset any losses?
I think a lot of people could argue that Walz isn't technically a progressive or wouldn't consider him to be one. So I don't think it's something to really like worry about in terms of losing moderate voters. I do think though that we need to think more about the fact that he could be tapping into a lot more voters that otherwise may not be motivated to vote or that are just really maybe fed up by like Democratic politicians who like promise progressive reforms but never actually, convey them forward. So I think it's really a win-win situation. Like the progressive voters are definitely going to be energized by this. And I think that moderates are not going to be fully opposed to what he's doing. I mean, Minnesota is a purple state and like he's very popular in that state. And I think Minnesota can be very comparable to the rest of the country, especially the Midwest where we have a lot of swing states and like places like Michigan, like Georgia. I think it's definitely possible that we're actually going to see a bigger voter turnout than otherwise.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what you saw what we saw over the past 24 hours after Harris selected Walz was an act of unity from our party that was amazing to see. We saw people from Joe Manchin, one of the most conservative Democrats in elected office, join with AOC and Bernie Sanders to overwhelmingly demonstrate their excitement for picking Walz. And I think there is kind of a balance that Walz strikes in his candidacy for a number of offices throughout his career. He is able to both present as a moderate Midwestern guy, uh, which, he kind of is. He owns a gun. He talks about going hunting. He talks about the experiences of everyday, more conservative or moderate Midwestern people. And he relates to that. And then he can also go into office and pass incredibly progressive pieces of legislation and do that while uniting Democrats of all different ideologies. And that's how we get legislation passed. That's how we build a progressive majority, as I like to say, that really is able to legislate and deliver victories that are absolutely necessary. Um, but one of the biggest criticisms that we've seen so far from Republicans against Wallace's selection and his record at large was his response to George Floyd, the protests that erupted after George Floyd's murder. Um, we saw that Governor Walz was sort of slow to send National Guards troops into Minneapolis to respond to some of those protests in a more, forceful way. So, do you think that this will be ultimately a successful message for Republicans against him? And how do you think that Democrats should respond?
I think that overall, like Governor Walz is trying to balance the narrative of like allowing free speech and protesters that are doing so peacefully while also trying to make sure that there isn't any violence occurring. And that's a really like, tightrope to walk on. Like we've seen that with student protesters when it came to the conflict in Gaza. Like I think there's a lot of parallels you can draw from both these instances. And it's hard to like be in power and like do the right thing and also kind of like, balance both sides and like also just appeal to both sides. But I think overall, like that isn't a talking point that is circulated as much just because I don't think it's as popular. I also think that's like old news, right? This was like back in 2020. I just don't think it's Republicans' um, best talking point if they really want to come for Walz. Like I've noticed that every time they like criticize him or even Vice President Harris, like it only makes them look better. Like genuinely, I don't know if these are really working. I don't think this is something Democrats really have to worry about because it's obvious that Governor Walz stands with Black Lives Matter protesters, and he values that movement. At the same time, he also unequivocally condemns violence of any sorts. And it's very obvious that, most Democrats in that position would do the same thing.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about how to respond to a Republican message, I usually take a break. I go for a bike ride. I break down their message into certain pieces, and then I organize my response. And I did that today for this, just as like an exercise. And I feel like there is a response that Democrats can make that really appeals and it has the opportunity to appeal to some of these swing or more conservative voters around his response. So in the wake of George Floyd's murder, yeah, there were some times where Governor Walz was a little bit slow to respond. And I believe that's because he had the interests of of young people, protesters, uh, at heart, and he was trying to protect them. And I agree with that. Some people don't. And I think what he can do to respond is say, first off, I did send National Guard troops. Let's make that clear because Donald Trump is going to lie and he's going to say, he never sent National Guard troops. The city was burning. He didn't respond. We got to make sure that he's messaging, I did send National Guard troops. I did respond. I did show leadership. I did show strength in that moment. And I served in the National Guard. I put my life on the line to protect communities from acts of violence, to serve our country, and connect that to his personal experience, and then make a really strong contrast with the guy who has not a leg to stand on this issue. Because during January 6th, when our democracy was being attacked by rioters that this guy incited to storm our nation's capital, he was the one who didn't call governors. He was the one who wasn't communicating. He was in office while all this chaos was going on, some of which he incited himself. And he didn't respond in a way that shows that he is prepared to keep communities safe, which makes sense because he is a convicted felon. And you have to bring everything back to that idea and that reality that he is a criminal. He is not able to protect you. And everything that he's saying around the border, around public safety, around security is completely wrong, is completely fake. He doesn't have a leg to stand on, like I said, because he is a criminal who has a record of not keeping communities safe. And we have to make sure that we are competing with that message because, it's accurate, it's true, it's convincing, and I think that, we're a party that rejects that violence, as you said, in all forms. And we're prepared to keep communities safe and win over voters over that issue. In selecting Governor Walz, Harris ultimately rejected other potential options for a running mate, including Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Senator Mark Kelly, and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Around a week ago, it seemed almost inevitable that Harris would either select Governor Shapiro or Senator Kelly. But after a number of concerns, either valid or invalid, arose around Kelly's previous lack of support for organized labor, and Shapiro's stance on student protests, his support for school vouchers, and his lack of governing experience, many Democrats, including the Harris team, viewed Governor Walz as a safe, ideological, and experiential choice. Do we think that the pressure from progressives to reject Kelly and Shapiro over their potential baggage played a significant role in Harris's ultimate decision?
Yeah, I do. I really do. I think that Governor Shapiro, while he has an amazing legislative record, from serving in the state legislature and then eventually becoming governor, I think that he comes with a lot of, like you said, baggage that I think youth voters are not going to be happy with. And I really do think that I really do think that like the excitement that we see right now from Governor Walz probably wouldn't be the same if it had been Governor Shapiro that was picked as a VP candidate. Like I really don't think we'd see that, especially from youth voters, which I really do think is going to make or break who wins the election. We've always known that like the margin of victory comes down to the youth vote. And I just don't think that there are a bunch of young people out there that are going to be this excited to get out and vote for Governor Shapiro, being on the ticket with Vice President Harris. So I definitely do think that. And I don't know if it's necessarily pressure from progressives, but I do think it's rather like the overall message of like him being relatable, but also like his record, right? Like let's look at Minnesota. Like I mean, there are very few people that wouldn't like the way that Minnesota like runs, from its state legislature to like its policies to like just overall like the quality of life in Minnesota is just really great. Like I was reading about this earlier today, and like their happiness index rating is very high compared to many other states, and it's number one rated in the United States for healthcare and access to healthcare, whether it's like reproductive rights, whether it's the actions they've taken for climate, public transportation. I mean, like the ideal dream is to make the United States like Minnesota, and I think that's something that many people just really wouldn't be opposed to, like even people who aren't progressives.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think that I think that what we saw was that there was so much excitement from young people. There was absolutely so much excitement. And I think that that also made a difference in Joe Biden's decision to step down in the first place, right? I mean, Harris was growing in popularity online. She was growing in popularity with young people, with organizations, with elected officials, with activists saying that they would support Harris. And now the same thing happened with Walz. And I think rather than maybe rejecting Governor Shapiro, I think that the support for Walz online and the pushback again, I guess, against Governor Shapiro, maybe gave like a permission structure to the campaign to say that if they chose Governor Walz, there would be ultimately like there would be support in waiting. There would be a group of people who are ready to donate, who are ready to volunteer, who are excited about this pick. And as you said, I don't think that movement of support would be there if Governor Shapiro were the ultimate running mate decision. Um, in rejecting Mark Kelly, I think the situation was a little bit different. Um, is this kind of showing that Mark Kelly, coming from a southwestern state of Arizona, which is obviously competitive in its own right, is this showing that maybe the Midwest is more of Harris's focus than the Southwest or the Southeast?
Yes and no. I think that one of the main reasons why they didn't pick Senator Mark Kelly is because Arizona is definitely more blue than like parts of the Midwest, I would say. Like they also hold a majority in the state legislature. Like Republicans hold that majority by just one seat. And I think it's very likely to be flipped. I mean, it shows and it says a lot that Mark Kelly was elected as a senator from that state, being a Democrat himself. And I don't see him losing his seat anytime soon. But that can't really be said the same for states in the Rust Belt, like Wisconsin, for example, I think is another key state. So I think focusing on the Midwest is smart. I also think that there's more electoral votes there. I also think the likelihood of Arizona flipping is much higher than the Midwest. So you got to focus on what we need, right? Like what is the highest priority? And I think the Midwest really is that. And I think it's perfect because drawing that contrast from Tim Walz to JD Vance is really perfect for voters in that state or in those states that are really on the fence about voting, or maybe they're independent voters that aren't really affiliated with either party, or maybe they're just fed up with both, because I understand that. And so that could really be the decision that makes or breaks. And I think that Tim Walz is probably the best person to do that.
Mhm. Absolutely. So in the lead up to this ultimate decision, as I said, a bunch of young activists and organizers were in support, coming out publicly in support of Tim Walz being Harris's running mate. So, Wally, did the college Democrats publicly support Tim Walz beforehand?
No, we did not. We wanted to keep our options open and keep an open mind to whoever Vice President Harris would pick. Ultimately, I do think this is her decision, right? I think it really is her administration, her campaign to run, and like someone that she feels most comfortable like doing this with, I think is what should matter. I know some youth orgs have endorsed Tim Walz or Bashir, or like candidates like that. But we decided it wasn't really our fight this time, and we were going to help win elect Democrats up and down the ballot, no matter who was picked.
Yeah, I think that show of unity is really important too. Um, so what was the reaction that you've seen from other young people? I mean, from the young people that I've talked to, it's been overwhelmingly positive over the past 24 hours after, in the wake of um, Walz's selection. What has the reaction been from young people in your circles?
I think just like sheer excitement. Like I'm gonna be so honest. Like I was watching the rally yesterday, like on TV when like Walz was giving a speech and he was talking about like how like JD Vance is like this guy who went to Yale and like acts like he can just like trash the entire Midwest and how he doesn't truly represent these people. And like I was getting chills and I was like, I have genuinely not been this excited about a candidate maybe since like 2008 when I was like a kid learning about Obama. Like I haven't felt this way, not about Joe Biden, not even about Vice President Harris, who I relate to a lot too. I just haven't felt this way. Like this is, I don't know. I feel like this is the Obama moment of our generation. Like I think it's true that like people out there are saying that. Like I just haven't seen that ever before, and like I have never been this like positive either. Like working in politics, it's so easy to be pessimistic and like, oh, things are never going to work out our way, or like everyone is going to be a sellout. But like you see people like Tim Walz and like that is a reason that like I think many people are willing to get up every day and like do the right thing and like vote for these people and go about their lives in a positive way.
I mean, I totally agree. I haven't seen this much energy probably since, yeah, for a very long time. Probably since 2018, when I think there was a lot of energy to get Donald Trump out of office from young people. But this is totally different because this is not a movement totally around a negative, framing of the other side. This is a movement of joy. This is a movement of community. This is about protecting our rights and freedoms and doing it in the most joyful, exciting way possible. And I think the Wall selection absolutely indicates that Harris is not treating this race just like a contrast between the prosecutor and the felon, which I think is a great message. But she is energizing young people. Walz is energizing young people, and she has made a selection that will further energize young people to get out and vote for something, not just against something. So in recent polls, Kamala Harris has been shown to be leading Donald Trump for the first time in a very long time in this election cycle that a Democrat has been leading in this presidential race. The 538 forecast now shows Kamala Harris having a better chance of winning in November versus Trump. And in the past week, the probability of Trump debating Kamala Harris has dropped significantly. And this seems to be, if Trump agreed to debate, that would seem to be one of the last moments where Donald Trump could potentially, I don't think he would, because Kamala Harris is a fantastic debater, but it would be one of the last moments where Donald Trump could kind of change the momentum in this race. And and with Harris giving her convention speech over in less than 2 weeks at this point, I believe, I think there's not many moments that Republicans are giving themselves or that Democrats are giving Republicans to change the pathway to victory for them, to make it more likely that they would ultimately win this race. So, what do we make of these recent polls that show Trump in a weak position going into November? And do we believe that there is room for Trump to make up some of the lost ground that he has lost to the Harris and Walz ticket?
It's hard to say, but I think one thing is for sure, Kamala Harris is definitely leading in the polls, but I think it's also important to be cautiously optimistic. Like we saw this in 2016 when people said Hillary was going to win, right? And like I think it's important we don't take voters for granted at all. I don't think we should act like we're going to win. If anything, I think we should pretend like we're going to lose just so we can organize the hardest we've ever done, and so we can ensure that victory in November. I do think though, like you brought up a great point. The debates I think really can help swing those voters, especially those that are on the fence. Um, and that really can push us over the edge. I think Kamala Harris is a phenomenal debater, and so is Tim Walz. And I'm excited for that because, I mean, I know clips of like debates will circulate a lot faster than like any public ads will. And I think that really can reach a lot of people that maybe just aren't as plugged in. Like I know I see this is like all I see in my Twitter feed, but I know some people who aren't really in this space. So for them to reach that, I think media is the best way, and like debates would be a really, really great way for Democrats to push themselves over the edge over Trump. I do think though it is going to be a bit hard for Trump to make up this the ground that he has lost after Joe Biden had stepped down. Because I think the main concern with like Democrats kind of losing was really just Joe Biden. Like it was the fact that he was old, that people didn't really feel like they related to him. And especially young voters. Like I don't think any 18-year-old, 20-year-old is thrilled to vote for somebody who's 81 years old, right? But I think Kamala Harris isn't like that. Like she might actually be 59, but she certainly does not look 59 or act like 59. She seems 10 years younger. And Tim Walz might look older than he actually is, but I think we can make an exception for him. And I think a lot of young people would be thrilled to elect somebody like him. So I think we've got a good shot. But I also think we need to work really hard to make sure that we actually win.
And speaking of that work, where can young people or our audience, whatever the age may be, go to support your work at the College Democrats of America in helping to win this election and get this job done?
Yeah, the College Democrats of America have chapters across many college campuses in the United States. Find your local chapter at your campus and join, and you can help us knock on doors, canvass for these candidates. You can help register your peers to vote, bring your friends to the polls, and most importantly, follow us all on of all of our socials, from Twitter to Instagram to TikTok, because that is really where we are amplifying a lot of our messages. And we host really cool events with like organizing calls with guest speakers that have high profiles, and we do a lot of fun stuff. Like there's just so much momentum in such a great community, and all these organizers, like they have a space to all come together and do the work that they all feel so energized to do. And I think it'd be great to have more people join our movement.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this week, and thank you everyone for taking a listen to this episode of Pod Save the Youth. See you next week.